Hi, everyone. The last topic we're going to cover in this entire class is shielding, which is obviously a pretty relevant topic to linear accelerators. They are probably the location with the highest intensity shielding that we have in the entire hospital. And that's just because of really the amount of radiation that is produced by these LINACs, the energy of them as well, and the directional aspect that they are actually very concentrated beams being pointed at these barriers. So there needs to be some pretty robust materials between that radiation beam and what lies on the other side of the vaults. So we're going to go into exactly how that is determined in order to keep that radiation where it needs to be and keep people outside of these vaults safe. There's actually quite a lot of work that goes into it. We're just going to touch on the very basics of it, but that's really all you'll need to be familiar with. I can't even speak on the true specifics of it. It's kind of a very specialized field to actually design the details of these LINAC vaults. You need a lot of experience with doing so, and you need to have pretty much just someone show you how it's done and some practice with it before you're ever going to actually be designing real world vaults. But with that said, we're going to cover just more generic shielding before we jump into the LINAC aspect of it. Shielding comes in many different forms. We use lots of portable shielding for really anytime you have a radioactive source. Machines producing radiation producing machinery is a little simpler because you can turn it off. When you have radioactive materials, you need a place to store them until they're being used. And that can be, temporary shielding, that can be shielded closets, locked shielded cabinets. We have what are called lead pigs. These are essentially just small leaded containers that usually hold small sources, whether it's a radiopharmaceutical for a patient or for a researcher doing some sort of study with radioactive materials. These are quite common in our office, in our waste rooms, all throughout the labs, just because they are necessary to store these things until you need to use them. When we do in-house patients that are treated with large activities, it's not uncommon to have to roll in things that look like this, these big mobile lead shields. They usually have at least an inch of lead in them, so they weigh hundreds and hundreds of pounds, if not more. But we will put them strategically around patients' beds and such, so that one, you can have nursing staff come in and speak with the patient, discuss things with the patient, and have some degree of shielding from those intense radiation levels. So you can allow patient families in the room, for periods of time. They can be set up so they're not in true, we say radiation isolation, but we don't want them to be in true isolation. So if we can configure a room to have, a larger room may have a small sofa in it that would allow somebody to come and visit with the patient while also having a safe dose rate in that area. That's something that we would set up, we would survey, and then we would have a consultation with the patient and the family to explain that this area is safe. A lot of other areas in this room are not safe to spend extended periods of time. This picture back here is what are called leaded blankets. They're not actually blankets. They're just, more flexible material. They're a little more mobile. You can hang them up, one after another if you need a lot of shielding, but they're a little easier to maneuver. I believe this picture is again from a nuclear power plant. They deal with a lot of contamination, not necessarily loose contamination, but because there's so many neutrons, some of the materials actually get activated to the point where they become radioactive themselves. So then when there's actual maintenance that needs to be done in the facility, you need to actually shield off certain areas of the area you're working on because they can have pretty high dose rates. So you put up temporary barriers like this, allow the work to get done, and then take them down. Usually permanent shielding is going to be a little more extensive, a little thicker, a little heavier, a lot thicker, a lot heavier generally. This is actually a peek behind the walls of a LINAC vault. They use stacked lead brick and then use, pretty sturdy steel holders to keep it in place. One complication that's always present are these, penetrations through the wall. That's something you have to plan strategically so you don't have gaps where the radiation is just flying through. So you can do that a number of ways. You can do angles through the wall so it's not a clear straight shot through. You can put them in locations that are not going to be occupied by people. There's a lot of strategies for that. And generally, when we take dose rates around these areas, we don't see any true elevated rates that we would be concerned about, though that's not always the case. I know when Monmouth was being built, I believe we did a survey on a PET CT room where they had been designed well and everything, but then in the last minute, I guess they drilled a hole for something that was going to be above the room. And sure enough, when we were going to do a survey, one spot on the floor in the room above had a pretty high reading, and that was because they had jeopardized the shielding in that area. So they had to open up the walls, redo, add a little more shielding, and make sure that it was in compliance. And that's stuff that we look for when we do surveys. We don't want to just accept that the design was good, so we think that the real world implementation of that design will be good. That survey is always a very important last step to make sure that everything kind of came to plan before it's occupied and put into service. One form of shielding that you don't really think about too much, but is actually probably the most common form of shielding, at least in the the clinical realm, is a patient's own body. So you have a patient that receives some activity of a radiopharmaceutical, and many different isotopes will have different energies that are shielded by the body in different varying degrees. But there's lots of cases where low energy radiation are used, and that outside of the clinical reason for that, from a safety standpoint, that's excellent, because that means that if it's in an internal organ, deeper in the body, then the actual dose rates that you would expect from a certain activity source never really pan out, because the patient's body can be shielding, up to 50% or more of the actual radiation that's coming out of that source. A lot of it's being deposited in the local tissue. That's what you want. That's why you put it there, for some sort of clinical outcome. But the reality is it also helps in a safety aspect and makes it so that the situation doesn't seem as bad as it would be on paper. If you say, okay, well, we just put 300 millicuries of I-131 in a patient, it should be this many R per hour. Family can only stand around them for a couple of minutes before they have to be worried about their radiation dose. It's like, oh, well, let's wait. We'll be there at the therapy. We'll take measurements on the patient. And sure enough, when we take those measurements at contact, 1 foot and 1 meter, the numbers are always much lower than you would theoretically expect, basically because the patient's own tissues are serving as a pretty reliable shield to lower those dose rates. So a lot of regulations don't take that into account, but they kind of give you an out to say that if you want to do the math and figure it out, your self-attenuation factors, that's what they're called. That's really the self-attenuation of the radiation by the patient. If you want to evaluate the situation yourself, you can take credit for that attenuation in your release criteria for these patients. So a lot of times, the therapies we do, we have lots and lots of patients. MSK is a very busy place. So once we've seen 1,000 or so patients, we have a pretty good idea of the range of shielding that a wide variety of patients will provide, and you can build some conservatisms into that, but ultimately it lets you get away with a little bit more than what the regulations outright say, which is, it's good for the patients, because you don't want to give overly cautious precautions when it comes to saying that a young patient can't see their family, can't see their children. You don't want to make them be in that isolation position for longer than they actually have to be safe. So if anything we can do to sort of calculate a more real world scenario in dealing with these patients, it's helpful for them, it's helpful for us. So it's something that we definitely try to do. But ultimately, when you're talking about shielding, you need to have some idea of the strength of the initial source. So one concept that really discusses that is called the gamma constant. So this is for radioactive materials, not for radiation producing machinery. It is solely for radioactive materials, and it's a reflection of the type of decay products that these isotopes actually give off. Some isotopes will only give off very low energy, infrequent photons. Some isotopes have multiple high energy photons that are, multiple per decay. So they would have a much greater radiation hazard. They would have a much higher gamma constant. And we can look at this chart here, and you can see that there's a bit of variation here. Something like I-125 has 0.275 MR per hour per millicurie at 1 meter, versus something like cobalt-60, which gives off multiple high energy photons that that gamma constant is something like 5 times higher. So that means a cobalt-60 source would have 5 times the amount of radiation per activity than an I-125 source. Sorry, my phone's going off. Okay. So you look at these units, and it's kind of a scary unit. There's a lot there, but if you just try to work through each term, so MR per hour is a dose rate. So that's going to rely on the activity that you have for that source. So per millicurie being activity, and then it's going to rely on some distance. The closer you get to a source, the intensity of that radiation is going to increase, and it's not on a linear scale. It's going to increase exponentially, and that's something we'll get to with the inverse square law. But it's important to know that actual dose rate coming off the source. You need to know how the activity of the source, and you need to know the distance. That will allow you to calculate sort of expected dose rates at various positions of a source, which is essentially what you're doing when you're designing shielding. You know a certain activity source is going to be used in a certain location. You have an idea of the isotope. So then you have to decide, okay, well, how much shielding do we need in the walls? And that's sort of really the whole process. But there's a lot of details in that simple 1, 2, 3 step. So I'd mentioned that the gamma constant has a distance associated with it. But say you don't want the dose rate at 1 meter, you want the dose rate at 3 meters. Your wall is 3 meters away. So you need to be able to modify these numbers to actually know the dose rate off of a certain activity source at the distance that you want. And that's where we get the inverse square law. And that pretty much says that, the intensity of a source at one distance is equal to the lowered intensity at a larger distance. So it's essentially saying that the distance is exponential compared to the intensity. Meaning, a simple way of saying is that if you double your distance, your radiation levels drop by 4. If you triple your distance, they drop by 9. Quadruple, they drop by 16. So that's where that square factor comes into play. And the reverse is true too. If you get closer, then the levels start to rise very quickly. Now, this is an approximation, because once you get closer and closer and closer to the source, it starts to fall apart. Once you start to divide by very, very small numbers, suddenly the numbers start to get very, very large, and that's not a true reflection of it. But fortunately, we're using this equation really in terms of real world distances of, at minimum, maybe a foot away. You really want to, some gamma constants will be at 1 centimeter. But even then, you really don't want to trust dose rates at 1 centimeter. It's more for use in designing a room where, you have a couple of meters. But using the gamma constant and this inverse square allows you to get a good approximation of radiation levels at anywhere you want to try to decide them. Getting even more math, and don't worry, we're going to go through lots of examples of all these equations until you guys are very familiar with them. That's why shielding is broken up into 2 classes or more if we need to, because I want you guys to be comfortable with all these equations. But this equation right here should actually look a little familiar to you guys, because it is the exact same form as the decay equation. It's just with the intensity of radiation instead of the activity or the dose rate. So the intensity of the radiation at a certain distance, or unshielded, or past a certain shield, is equal to the initial intensity times e to the negative natural log of 2 over the half value there. So the half value there is sort of the analog for half-life when you're talking about decay when you're talking about shielding instead of decay. So the math is exactly the same. You just have to have, like when you're doing a decay equation, you need to know the initial activity and you need to know the half-life. For a shielding equation, you need to know the initial radiation intensity and you need to know the half value layer of the material that is actually doing the shielding. So we'll work through a couple of these until you guys are familiar with it. So you'll see that this mu here is equal to the natural log of 2 over the half-life, much like the decay constant, which is lambda, is equal to the natural log of 2 over the half-life. So really, they are identical equations. If you know how to manipulate one, you should know how to manipulate the other. It's just a matter of getting the right information for these for the equations. Okay. So getting back to that mu factor, or the half value there, you need to know the material that you're going to be using, because that has a big factor on the attenuation coefficient. So that's going to be based on pretty much 2 factors. That's based on the density of the material in question and the energy of the radiation. So that's why when you think of good shielding materials, you think of things like lead or even depleted uranium, because they are incredibly dense materials. If you think about the actual photons that are, if you try to picture an individual photon moving through space, it sees the world at an atomic level. And an atomic level is a nucleus and tons of empty space that has lots of electrons flying through. So that empty space becomes less empty space as you get higher and higher density. If you have lead is a very large nucleus. It has lots and lots of electrons, so that empty space is sort of less empty in a very dense material, because there's lots more electrons for these photons to interact with and to lose some of their energy, to scatter to lower energy, to scatter to different directions. You remember if you think back to photon interactions, they could be completely absorbed by electron, they could be scattered by electron, or they can produce a pair production that will essentially dissipate the energy just as well. So yeah, we talk about attenuation. Attenuation is really just a fancy word for the radiation beam becoming less intense as it moves through matter. And that's because some of these photons are being absorbed by electrons in the material. Some of them are being scattered off to different directions. So that all serves to lower the dose rate. And that's what we're looking for when we're putting shielding in place. And that's where that mu coefficient comes in. So that mu really just represents, it's an inverse centimeter, kind of like the lambda is inverse time or inverse second. So really what that represents is how much that radiation beam is attenuated per centimeter. So if you have a very, very good shielding material, it will have a high mu value because a lot of the radiation will be stopped in that single centimeter. Whereas if you have a very, very poor shielding material, you would need many meters or more of it to actually really attenuate an intense radiation beam. So you'll see that attenuation coefficients are specific to isotope and to material. So that's because the amount of attenuation is dependent, again, on the energy of the radiation and the material that is doing the attenuating. So that's why there's going to be lots and lots of values that you have to look up if you're going to be designing, say, a vault that is used for iridium-192. That is a common isotope for HDR units, where they use very, very high activity sources. So you would need to know that, okay, well, I have a 10 curie iridium source and my room is 4 meters by 4 meters, and on the other side of the wall is this and that and this and that. How much lead do I need? Well, I got to look up my attenuation coefficient for iridium, and I'm knowing the gamma constant for iridium, you can then start to use some of those equations that we went over, or that we saw earlier in the presentation, to begin figuring out exactly how much shielding that you require. I'm introducing this topic of buildup. It's important that you understand what it is. Unfortunately, the tricky concept behind it is that the variable for it is B. And when we get into the second part of shielding, there's another variable that is also B. I don't know why it is that way, but unfortunately that gets very confusing. So just for a testing purpose, I'm not going to ask questions about buildup. We'll get into the actual variable B as a transmission factor next class. But I just want you to understand in principle what buildup actually represents. So if you have a radiation beam coming through a shielding material, through a shield, there's going to be a variety of energies. Even if you have a radioactive source that only spits out one energy radiation, there's going to be scatter. There's going to be all sorts of influences that are making that radiation not that monoenergetic beam. So when you, as that, that range of energies of radiation now are moving through the shield, the lower energy radiation is going to be stopped more prominently than the higher energy radiation. And that means that as that lower energy radiation gets stopped more and more, what's left behind is a higher energy radiation beam. And when you strip out all the low energy stuff, that means that you need more shielding. In the deeper you go into the shield, the less is going to get stopped because you're only left with that high energy stuff that's not stopped as easily. So to counteract that in a real world setting, there's what's known as buildup factors. And again, they are just charts of information that you can see that as you get deeper and deeper into a larger and larger shield, these factors start to go up quite a bit to the point where they can have a pretty significant influence on your equations. And if you were to fail to account for them, you could be off by a factor of 10 or more, which in a real world setting is a pretty big problem. So if you're doing any calculations for an actual shielded room, you would need to take this into account and make sure that you're not under shielding because you think that the actual beam is going to stay the same as it moves through that shield. When you talk about meters of concrete, that's not just a small little space. There's a lot that's changing with that radiation as it moves over that course of distance. So that's a very necessary factor to include. But for our very superficial look at radiation shielding, I am not going to ask any questions about buildup just because I don't want to have two B variables kicking around on any sort of questions that I ask, because that's just way too confusing. I'll try to be as clear as possible when I'm talking about B as a transmission factor versus B as a buildup factor. So it'll make more sense when we get to the second class, and I'll repeat this incessantly to the point where you're annoyed by it. But I just want to make sure that it's very clear as we're working through these equations that what all the variables mean, because that's the the start for understanding how to manipulate these equations is actually understanding what each term represents, and that's what I'm going to be trying to start with for the shielding introduction. I mentioned half value there and how it's similar to a half-life. It's sort of the half-life for shielding. What it represents is the amount of material it takes to take a certain intensity radiation beam and reduce it to half that intensity. That's really what it means. It has a half-life is the amount of time it takes to reduce the activity to half the activity. The half value there is the amount of material it takes to reduce an radiation beam to half. And so that's a good way to just gauge how hard certain energy radiations are to actually shield, and also how good of a shield one material is versus another. You could see lead versus concrete. Lead is much more effective. It stops high energy and low energy radiation much more readily than concrete. But why do people use concrete? Well, for a number of reasons. Concrete is incredibly cheap. Lead fluctuates, but it can be very expensive. Concrete also has a lot of hydrogen in it. So it not only shields photon radiation over a large enough distance, but it's also an incredibly good neutron shield. So if you don't want to have to deal with lead and then sort of specialty plastics that are neutron shields, you can kind of have an all-in-one LINAC shield made out of concrete. And so why don't we do that? Well, if you think about our main campus, we have LINAC vaults that are in the middle of the building. in the middle of the building in Manhattan on the Upper East Side. So you don't really have the luxury of having walls that are a couple meters thick. You don't even have the means to get the material in there. But even if you did, you would have to have a building that was completely dedicated to a couple of Linac vaults. So they opt to go for the more expensive option of lead sandwiched with that neutron absorber plasticky material, and you kind of make little sandwiches of the two, and they do just as a good a job as concrete. It's just they're going to be more expensive, but they buy you a lot more space. So the half value layer and mu are related in much in the same way that the half-life and lambda are related, which makes sense because mu is a measure of how well something attenuates a radiation beam. So the half-life, it makes sense that the half-value layer would be smaller for, you know, a material that is good at attenuating radiation. And so this is the equation that links the two. Very often you'll see charts like this where you can actually look up the half-value layer. You know, if you know the material you're working with, and you know the energy or radiation, you find where you're, you know, you try to hit the points for where you would, you know, for your specific situation, and then you can use that information for your shielding calculations. And there's also something known as a 10th value layer, though it's less commonly used, but it's essentially the amount of material that needs to be in place to reduce the radiation intensity by a factor of 10. So it's like a half value layer, except it's reduced by 10 instead of by 2. The math behind it is a little bit different, and they don't exactly line up, again, because they take into account that buildup factor. But for our purposes, everything we need to do can be done with half value layer. So I want to introduce this as another concept. I want you just to understand what the 10th value layer means, but we are not going to be using it in any sort of math to, you know, manipulate these equations to figure out, you know, thicknesses of shielding material that we would need. Okay, so I'm going to leave off the examples for now. We're gonna have a class on Monday about this, so we will save the examples for running through at that point. And that's really going to be what hopefully makes a lot of this clear. I know it's a lot of information at once. Shielding is a pretty loaded subject, and it's a lot more math heavy than a lot of the other stuff we've done. So it's something that the more you see it, hopefully the more familiar you get with it. And the first time you see it, it's probably just going to be, you know, it's going to be a foreign language. But nonetheless, don't get discouraged, and we will meet on Monday to really start digging into it. And hopefully you guys come with lots of questions so we can really clear it up for everybody. But that's it for now. I will see you guys on Monday.